Hi, I'm not sure if anybody can still hear me or not. Perhaps somebody could put something in the chat if they could hear me. That would be great. Yeah, it's loud and clear. Fantastic. Thank you. So where was I? Okay, back. It's not even that far, to the Netherlands. And anyway, and where were we? So we have been working and building and researching in timber for about 20 years, and that really sprung from fascination and consternation, really about sustainability and about the environment. And obviously, this is something that is growing and emerging as an understanding. And for us in the UK, 15, 20 years ago, we began to get some changes in the building regulations, some changes in building code around planning law, around sustainability. And these kind of took the form of checklists. And yet it seemed to us, that actually, if these issues around our climate, around the carbon emissions of buildings were so important, then we needed to be grasping these as an essential core part of the architecture, of the construction development that we're proposing, not just a add-on. So that these shouldn't be added, put a solar panel on the roof, then you don't have to worry about anything. That actually this needs to form a core part of our architecture, needed to form a core part of how we think about buildings, how we think about development. So that really gave rise to us thinking about different ways of building buildings. And very quickly that became a kind of a journey into understanding, thinking about, researching into timber construction. And in 2003, we built our first engineered timber building. And then in 2007, we designed our first tall timber building without really realizing that nobody else had done it before. I think we just kind of were really sort of plowing our own furrow, because it was part of quite an introverted research within the practice. And that gave rise to our first timber building in 2008, our first tall timber building in 2008, Murray Grove, which was 9 stories and 29 apartments. And that was, we built that in 11 months, which was a very exciting process. And by tall, I mean kind of anything more than sort of, actually in 2008, I think there was maybe a few buildings of sort of 3 and 4 stories, but nobody had built a building as tall as that. In fact, I was invited to Austria to meet the manufacturers, and was told that it was not a good idea and that the material hadn't been designed for that. But anyway, so we worked through that. And actually, in terms of building code and in terms of regulations, it was actually relatively straightforward to achieve, because the data was there to demonstrate that you could do it. And because nobody had done it before, actually, just by presenting the data to the building code authorities, we were able to demonstrate that this building would comply. And so we finished that building in 2008 and began to really expand upon that kind of body of work. And in 2017, another example I was going to show you was a much larger building, this building about 32 meters tall, 17,000 square meters of development in residential and commercial. And we built that entire structure in 5 months. It's about 2,000 tons of timber involved in that. So about 2,500 trees, and a building for 800 people. So about 3 trees per person in the building, living and working in the building. So really that, the idea of kind of generating a sort of an architecture which is a valid, a viable alternative to concrete and steel, has been core to the practice's kind of response to issues around climate change. And the idea that we could actually begin to change that kind of developmental construction addiction to concrete and steel has been a very important part of that of the ongoing conversation that we've been having as a practice. Now that as you change a building material, as you begin to rethink about what you build buildings out of, you realize that the process of construction changes, and that starts to, I think, beg some questions about, what have we got used to in terms of how we build in the last 100 years. And we realize that actually the process of building in concrete and steel is actually one that is always a kind of project-based process. So every time you start a building, it's though you've never done it before, and everything is kind of completely reinvented from the word go. So there's no kind of so opportunities for prefabrication are much more complex because the building materials that we have to work with are much heavier. They're much more difficult to manipulate. So as we began to expand our understanding and our research into timber, we also realized that there were opportunities within that to begin to prefabricate, to begin to plan out systems of construction and of design using parametric modeling. And I think that an increasingly kind of sophisticated building information management system, so it really sophisticated IT, combined with a very simple rudimentary material, because really it's just planks of timber that you're kind of gluing together, sometimes in parallel, sometimes cross-laminated, really straightforward and simple kind of manufacturing process to produce this material. And yet the way in which we put together these buildings is really sophisticated. So the connection details, the way that we plan out the engineering, the kind of how the timber gets thinner as it goes up the building, how we're using different types of connections, different types of timber for wind load and that kind of thing, really begins to inform the notion of a different type of construction. Can somebody put in the chat how long they want me to talk for? Because I don't know that either. So we kind of so that kind of journey into thinking about how we build has been a really important part of our kind of research over the last 10 years, and we're now working not only in residential projects to prefabricate, to design in modular and panel systems, but also in commercial buildings as well. So investigating kind of parametric opportunities to propose kind of commercial buildings has been really kind of it's kind of very much part of our practice now. And then also, so you change material, you change the process, and then the architecture begins to emerge, right? Then the kind of the way in which these buildings are designed to take advantage of those processes begins to really infect or affect the architecture. And I think that's kind of the exciting journey that you can see that's happening globally now, where people are all over the world are really understanding that this a new type of kind of architecture is an opportunity, so that architects, developers, contractors can be part of a solution. They can be part of a solution for climate change, rather than really being the kind of one of the primary problems for climate change. So that's really, I think, an exciting proposition, and an exciting opportunity for architects and for people involved in construction. So I've got about 3 or 4 minutes now. I'm really happy to answer some questions. How do planning and conservation officers react to this way of building? It really depends on the individual. I think that that it's a really, all of our planning law in the UK, and really from our understanding through most of Europe and the Western world, is all about reducing the carbon in the operation of buildings, so the heating, lighting, air conditioning of buildings, and it's about reducing that carbon. But actually, that carbon as a proportion of the carbon of construction right now is minimal. And because we're in a climate emergency, because we have 10 years to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, then what we need to be doing is looking at things right now. And that's a really simple and straightforward narrative to be able to engage with cities and engage with planners. Timber frame versus mass timber. Timber frame, I think, is really effective way of using timber on lower rise buildings. And I think that the mass timber is about high density urban housing, high density office buildings in the center of our city. And for me, to my mind, that's really where the issues are. Because as the world becomes increasingly more urbanized and those urban situations become denser, then it's about solving those problems, solving those kind of density. Where do you get the wood from? Mostly Austria, but you know what? Now from France and from Sweden, from Norway, Spain, and the when we built our first CLT building, there was about 2,000 cubic meters made a year, and I think next year the projections are about 1.5 million cubic meters. We would love to get the wood from the UK, and we are trying. We have very few trees. We have tree coverage probably not dissimilar to yours, so we don't have very many trees. But things are changing here. So I think that will be imminent in the UK. Do you see Keelstag behind you? Yes, you do. Look at that. Look, isn't that fantastic? So this is a type of slab using sterling board and pines. That's beautiful material. How do you solve problems with sound since the weight is much lower than concrete? By separating layers, by having mass in. My favorite one to use at the moment is sand. So just regular sand. You put sand on top of the CLT, just like you would have done 150 years ago. And that sand produces the mass. So that's been, we haven't yet worked with Keelstag, we want to. Do you think this will replace other building materials? It has to. I mean, we will always need concrete and steel, for foundations, for connections, etc. We just have to wean ourselves off the notion of concrete and steel as our primary construction materials, and we have now a viable alternative. Is there enough knowledge about timber buildings in the UK? Never enough. Always more to think about, always more to learn. Are wooden buildings still as good for the climate if the trees are transported? Yes, they are. So actually, the emissions from transportation are really tiny compared to the amount of kind of CO2 that you're capturing and storing within a timber building. Exactly as just JK has just said there. What is the best way to increase the building speed in mass timber? By talking, by changing the conversation, by discussing these things, and I think just by pushing the boundaries. Are you frequently confronted with aesthetic resistance? Yes, wood facades are a difficult one. I think that wood facades now. There are obviously fire issues for taller buildings with timber facades. I think that there is an expectation in European culture that buildings should look new, that new buildings should look new for a long time. And timber, like us, tends to go grey and warp a bit as it gets older. So I think this is a kind of like this, there are cultural changes that will happen as we engage in the implications of changing our lifestyles towards a kind of more responsible planetary situation. And I think that probably that is one of them. Which literature is the best to learn the basics about CLT and wood in particular? There are some great publications by Berkhauser, Detail magazine. Actually, if you go online for lots of the CLT manufacturers, they also have kind of really, I think, very straightforward websites which give good access to their materials. What do you think of so-called hybrid systems? We have built-in hybrid systems, steel and timber. We haven't really used concrete and timber. I don't think that is often a sensible hybrid. It's not something that we have looked at as a practice. Steel works quite well. Steel's much more easily recyclable, though it has a heavier carbon footprint itself. It's a much more easily recyclable material. Also, if you use bolted connections, not welded connections, you can move things around a lot more easily. Is there an eco-friendly natural glue for CLT panels? Not yet, but they're working on it. And just about the seal, it's a polyurethane adhesive, PU adhesive. There's less than 1% of volume. It's pretty inert. You can pulp CLT for paper, you can burn it, you can chip it to make it into sterling boards. So they're a good, it's an issue, but it's such a minor one at the moment, is my opinion. Do you see a risk in changing UK regs that are spoken about? Yes, I do. I think that, finally the Austrians are fire testing really comprehensively at the moment. So although there are issues and there are concerns around fire, we need more fire testing, and that is being done. I think that those flames are being fanned by the global concrete industry, and I think we need to be aware of that as well. I mean, they are reacting at the moment in the same way that that the tobacco companies were reacting in the 90s, and I think that we need to be aware of that and engage with the concrete manufacturers as well. How do you protect timber from the rain? How do you convince your clients? How do you convince your clients to go for an all timber building? By telling them and explaining them how beautiful it is, how much good they're doing for the planet is the first conversation. But the second conversation, the important one, is about cost and program. And we built timber buildings for 15 years by proving that they were more cost efficient than concrete and steel alternatives. Is the use of DLT, CLT possible? I'm not a massive fan of DLT. It's more, I think, more difficult to, easier to manufacture in many ways, but I think more difficult to recycle, more difficult to adapt. One of the things that we really enjoy about CLT buildings is how adaptable they are. We just cut a big hole in a slab in a commercial building we've just done, and actually constructed a staircase in a building that was already built. And that was a really simple, straightforward process. So that adaptability of timber buildings, I think, is really important. What is more expensive? Why is it more expensive than traditional building? I think that in our experience, if you design a building and then cost it in timber without designing it in timber, then you will inevitably have a more expensive building. So you need to design from the first concept in timber. You need to design with the real, with a joy and a passion for timber in mind. Do you see a promising future for modified wood cladding? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I think that kind of acetylized timbers, thermally modified timbers, I think all of those things are definitely, we see a future for those things. I see clapping hands and a phone call from the Netherlands. That's probably me, and we're probably going to say goodbye.